So, as I said at the a few minutes ago, this building Indigenous economic development partnerships is so incredibly important because it just builds on what is fundamental in the Indigenous community, and that's relationships. And having good relationships and building partnerships. So many times people with good intentions have gone into Indigenous communities, done something wonderful, and then left. And we need to empower people to be able to continue on with the work that's being done and feel a part thereof. So I'm anxious to hear what's going to be said today. We've got three very interesting speakers. We've got Carol Ann Hilton, the CEO of Indigenomics Institute, Kelly Lindsay, President and CEO of Indigenous Works, and Tabitha Bull, President and CEO of Canadian Council of Aboriginal Businesses. So I'm going to introduce Tabitha here and give you a little bit of a rundown on how wonderful she is. She's a proud member of the Nipissing First Nation. It's near North Bay, Ontario. And she is currently the President and CEO of the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Businesses, working with Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal businesses to help strengthen a prosperous Indigenous economy and Canadian market. She's an electrical engineer from the University of Waterloo, led the First Nations Métis Relations team at the IESO, Ontario's Electricity System Operator. Tabitha serves as the director of the board of the Wigwam and Housing and is a member of Young People's Theatre in Toronto. So Tabitha, if you would maybe, I invite you to kind of give us some key points or factors to consider when forming partnerships within the Indigenous community. And welcome.
Nani Bushu Miigwech, and thank you so much for the opening prayer. It's always so important, and it's really nice for me to be able to connect in that way through these discussions, being that I'm here in Toronto and not in my home community. So Miigwech for that. Welcome to everyone who's here, and thank you to Ryerson for holding this important discussion today. So as per the bio, I am the President and CEO of Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and our work is solely on helping businesses to build those networks between Indigenous and non-Indigenous business, and also to help build education through the business lens. And a significant amount of our work is looking at research on the Indigenous economy and understanding how we can grow that economy through partnerships, through building capacity within community and within businesses, and from seeing how we can really open up our networks and open up networks of corporate Canada to Indigenous business, because really that network and opportunity and building those strong relationships is so important. So I really want to get into the discussion, hear from everyone else, but I do want to highlight a few key points where so my background was in electrical engineering. I worked across the province of Ontario with First Nation and Métis communities on partnerships on renewable energy for about 5 years. So just wanted to share a little bit in what we really learned through that process. By the end of the time there, prior to the renewable energy procurement ending in the province of Ontario, there were close to half of the First Nation communities were partnered or had some participation in a renewable energy project. So we really were able to grow that work through iterating the various ways that we mandated and incented for partnerships, but it did take some time. And I think if we can all think back to the very beginning of that period of time, what I would have changed or what things I really would have highlighted, I just want to share a few of those. So I think the first is the importance of time. It really isn't enough to just incent proponents to partner with communities. You need time to build those relationships and for the communities to discuss the impacts and engage their members amongst themselves. And that time has to be built into any process on partnership. So I think we all know that partnerships must be built on trusting relationships, and we all know that those take time to develop. In my own community of Nipissing, we're quite a well-established and have considerable economic growth. But the decision to use revenues from money that was held in trust to invest in renewable projects was made through many community engagement sessions held both off and on reserve and online engagement, and was only decided through ratification of a vote of our members. The decision to choose to partner on a project was also made through a number of in-person community engagement sessions. So that's a significant investment of time and money of both community staff, our elected band members, whose portfolios do not only include energy or economic development, but they're also have to focus on mental health and education and elder care. So that amount of time that the community has to invest in wanting to know whether they want to partner is significant and can't be condensed into a very small period. The second is the importance of building capacity and readying communities to be able to evaluate partnerships. We heard from a number of communities across Ontario that they were not equipped to respond to proponents asking to partner in the timelines that the proponents required. So while we can continue to assert that proponents must build relationships, that's difficult to enforce. So how do we better prepare communities for what's coming? We need to ensure that early engagement on any type of project or planning, in this case, energy and infrastructure planning, and potential projects so that communities are as informed as the potential partners, or even better, and what we really want to see is that the communities have an ability to become the proponent themselves. So that means long before the actual project, but when we start to see a need in the area, that's when we need to be engaging with communities. Indigenous communities, of course, value their values on the environment, and their consideration of the impact on water and treaty rights is strikingly different than most potential partners. I know we say that often, but I don't think developers really grasp how different it is. As an example, what corporation thinks about the impacts of any project on their decision or their seventh generation? Who sits around a board table in downtown Toronto and thinks about the impacts on their descendant that's going to be born in 2215? This takes so much time to evaluate, to understand, and is particularly difficult with new technologies for which we have no history of the impact. If we can resource communities to begin this work now, then we are better enabling them to make good decisions for all of our future when the project becomes a potential reality. Additionally, many communities in the energy infrastructure told us they need more support to be better prepared to respond and participate in the conversation. This could include funding for full-time energy workers within the community, support with respect to evaluation of financial models, community engagement plans, and community governance. And then I think the third is, don't be afraid to ask the questions. You're all here today because you have an interest in this, and I think you should be commended for that. I'm sure many of you have heard of the book Dare to Lead by Brené Brown. The book, as per the title, is about being courageous and the need to be vulnerable, to have courage and create a space in which all of your employees are able to lead. Within the first 50 pages, I'd earmarked almost every other page, but there's a really important quote, and it reads, "People are opting out of vital conversations about diversity and inclusivity because they fear looking wrong, saying something wrong, or being wrong. Choosing your own comfort over hard conversations is the epitome of privilege, and it corrodes trust and moves us away from meaning and lasting change." I know sometimes, particularly with Indigenous communities or Indigenous issues, people are worried about saying the wrong thing or asking the wrong question for fear of being offensive. But that has only served to stall conversation, our collective learning, and this country's progress. So with that, I'm really looking forward to your questions on the panel today. Chimigwech.
Wow, that was very good, Tabitha. Thank you so much for that. Let me turn on my video here. Yeah, thank you so much for that. That was amazing. I've got tons of things I wanna talk about once we get past the other panelists here. So now I would like to introduce Caroline. Caroline is recognized First Nation business leader and advisor with an international master's degree in business management from the University of Hertfordshire, England. Wow, very nice. I hope I didn't massacre that too badly. Caroline currently serves on the BC Emerging Economy Task Force as an advisor to the Minister of Jobs, Trades and Technology, as well as on BC's Indigenous Investment Council for the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. She was appointed a senior advisor to the Federal Finance Minister on the Canadian Federal Economic Growth Council. Caroline is currently authoring Indigenomics, a global power shift. Caroline's work has been recognized with an Outstanding Business Achievement Award from the BC's Achievement Foundation, Excellence in Aboriginal Relations Award from the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Businesses. She currently serves as the director of the McGill University Institute for the Study of Canada, the National Canadian Community Economic Development Network, as well as a juror on the National Smart Cities Challenge. She is an instructor at Simon Fraser University Community Economic Development Program and a faculty lead at the Banff Center Indigenous Business Program, where she is also a Fleck Fellow. So welcome aboard, Caroline. I can hardly wait to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to come spend time with this group today. I bring greetings from Victoria, BC, and I'm from the New Channel region, and would like to acknowledge the leadership in your business school for bringing this conversation together today and paying attention to the Indigenous economy and its emerging strength. I put a couple slides here together with a focus on moving beyond the socioeconomic gap in the emerging $100 billion Indigenous economy. As the founder of the Indigenomics Institute, what has been important to me is to be able to facilitate a narrative that future paces the economic reality of this country. Some of you may have begun to understand or have heard of the word Indigenomics, and really the concept is about leadership in the collective economic response to the lasting legacy of the systemic exclusion of Indigenous peoples in the development of this country. What is important in that concept is to begin to demonstrate a pathway of Indigenous economic design. So looking at the construct, tools, and resources in the emerging $100 billion Indigenous economy. What is important within that is to be able to understand what it is that we're designing for. So I refer to Indigenomics as designing for our current Indigenous poverty levels, addressing the long-term systemic devaluing of Indigenous knowledge systems. So our historicals, ways of being and knowing, and the significance of our knowledge in sustainability and how we experience the modern economy today. To be designing for increasing Indigenous social and economic well-being, to design for the inclusion of Indigenous worldview in long-term national and global economics, and to address the conditions of Indigenous economic regression as a structure of economy itself. The intention is to be able to bring visibility to Indigenous economy regionally and nationally, to increase the role and visibility of Indigenous entrepreneurs and businesses, to be able to move out of a problem frame towards collaborative approaches to community economic development, and to move our language constructs beyond the socioeconomic gap. What that essentially means in understanding the history of the development of this country is moving the Indigenous economy beyond Indian Act economics itself. To understand what is the conditions of economic regression of Indigenous peoples is a required level of honesty that this country needs to be able to understand and teach within its business schools and within our schools at the across the full spectrum of education within this country. Indigenomics is addressing the structural economic unfreedom of poverty itself. It's bringing into visibility the concept that the cost of doing nothing outweighs the risk of doing nothing. That is the intersection that we're currently within this country. and to be able to address the conditions of a potential Indigenous market failure. The concept of Indigenomics is restoring the narrative away from Indigenous peoples are a fiscal burden towards Indigenous peoples are economic powerhouses and demonstrating that through economic value. To be able to design modern, constructive, generative economic design essentially means facilitating our relationships for economic success, designing our institutions, tools, and financial architecture towards the emerging $100 billion Indigenous economy. This is about recognizing the shifting influence of Indigenous people, that it's understood that over 20% of Canada's land base is controlled by Indigenous peoples. This is the shifting sphere of influence that we need to be able to pay attention to and understand that in the realm of economic strength. That we have over 250 legal cases won within the Supreme Court that describes this emerging economic space. That the new environment that Canada exists within 2020 is the recognition that we are both in a legal and an economic relationship with Indigenous peoples. What is important to me today to express to you is that language matters. We need to be able to shift towards measuring economic strength. That the socioeconomic gap expresses the experience of marginalization of Indigenous peoples. As long as we call out from the margins of this country, we need to be able to facilitate the leadership, the language structures of economic empowerment, measuring what matters, and instead of measuring how we're falling behind and the experience of that is expressed through poverty and lack of well-being, that understanding economic outcomes and economic growth is really the future story that this country has an opportunity to begin to speak and to be able to research from that perspective. The Indigenomics Institute facilitates a research pathway facilitated from a 100-year vision of an Indigenous economy that was hosted at the 2019 Indigenomics Economic Conference. That it was with the core objective to be able to move beyond the Indigenous economic gap, to be moved beyond the stories of those challenges and limitations. As long as I am tall, there is enough research that describes the challenges and limitations of the Indigenous economy. Instead, we need to be able to focus on constructive, generative economic design, to be able to focus on core areas of innovation and how Indigenous economic strength is being facilitated of how we have been able to create the space for our businesses and create the space within our legal relationship to the state and to the provinces and territories. I look at two specific examples. A report identified a First Nations infrastructure gap that identified a staggering infrastructure deficit of as much as $30 billion. While this was northern focused research, again, the second example I draw your attention to is through the National Indigenous Economic Development Board Workforce Gap Report, which has a catchy title and establishes Canada's untapped Indigenous workforce is worth $27.7 billion, a new report says. We need to be able to move beyond these types of headlines in Indigenous economic research and facilitate an actual pathway for what does that collectively look like for the actualization of the Indigenous workforce. We need to be moving beyond these gaps, challenges, and limitations and the construct of the metrics of them and actually demonstrates economic strength in the marketplace used through the facilitation of the financial architecture that's required in the capitalization of the Indigenous economy. What we begin to see is more recent examples such as the Atlantic Region Economic Performance Report or the Manitoba Indigenous Economic Strength Report that instead begins to shape a future of Indigenous economic inclusion and place value on the growth and picture of the demonstration of Indigenous economic strength regionally. Indigenomics by design is moving from information around challenges and limitations to constructive generative economic design, measuring outcomes, impact, and strength to be able to build on the hotspots of Indigenous economic activity. Where is it that we're seeing success? The Institute has established a concept within the $100 billion Indigenous economy is 12 levers to support the growth and design of a $100 billion Indigenous economy, where we, instead of looking at gaps and challenges, we look at where leadership is happening and where those connections are establishing strength in economic outcomes and performance. Examples of these include equity, infrastructure, procurement, trade, clean energy, entrepreneurship, capital, reconciliation in the philanthropic economy, commerce, technology, and the investment environment. When you look at economic levers as language that supports the evolution of the Indigenous economy, future pacing the economic reality of this country is essential. Indigenomics is the process of claiming our place at the economic table of this country, because the Canada that embraces the future of work for Indigenous peoples is inclusive and built on solutions for today, driven by recognition of our growing and collective economic strength. I would like to draw your attention to the newly shaped Global Center of Indigenomics, which will house the virtual global Indigenous marketplace based on these 12 levers of Indigenomics and the levers to support the growth and design of the Indigenous economy. And lastly, to draw your attention to a newly released book coming in the fall, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table. Thank you for your participation. This is really about raising the economic baseline of this country. When we pay attention to it and understand the metrics behind it, what is essentially important is what I want to be able to leave you with, that a $100 billion Indigenous economy is not only possible, but it is essential to the success and to the conscious identity of Canada itself in overcoming the colonial structures which founded the systemic exclusion of Indigenous people. Our future is not only possible based on the reality of putting a metric on Indigenous economic design, but calling to the leadership of what a $100 billion Indigenous economy looks like. Who wants to play Indigenomics? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol Ann. And my apologies. I realized that I switched to the order that Kelly was supposed to go. So you were so sweet not saying anything and just hopping in there. So thank you for that.
Always happy.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to introduce Kelly. Kelly is a social entrepreneur who is internationally recognized as one of Canada's foremost innovators and organizational development experts in workplace models, corporate Indigenous partnerships, and Indigenous inclusion strategies. His dynamic communication styles and social entrepreneurial success has earned him the reputation of an engaging, thoughtful leader and effective bridge builder. Sorry. A proud Canadian of Indigenous leader of Métis Cree, he moves seamlessly between both worlds. He is honored by the University of Saskatchewan as one of their 100 alumni of influence in the last century, whose accomplishments have been recognized for influencing the growth and development of the university, the province, and the world during the last century. Well, congratulations on that, Kelly. And the spotlight is on you now.
Thank you, Elder Joanne. Great. You should be a professional MC. You got a really good ambience with the crowd. And I'm speaking to you today, folks, from Treaty 6 and the Métis homeland of Saskatchewan, here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And thank you to Ryerson for hosting this series, and great to be here with my two friends and colleagues, Tabitha Bull and Carol Ann Hilton. I'm the person on the left. have to sometimes point that out, Joanne. I go to conferences, and if they don't know it's a male, they sometimes think it's going to be this very attractive woman here speaking on the right. So I want to sort of pick up, I'll tell you a bit about us first, is that we were created in 1998 as one of the recommendations in that 1996 report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Today, we're ISO certified national organization. Our focus is really on workplace, employment, and workforce and systems, and also looking at the engagement systems more from a competency-based approach when we look at partnerships and engagements. We're expanding our work in the research area, doing some work with SHRC and NSERC and MyTax. I want to look back historically, and if you look at this area of economic partnerships, what's interesting is if you look back at the Hudson Bay, and everyone talks about the fur trade, they actually had to create a unit of currency so that we could trade with the First Nations and Métis people. And if you think of this like the Dow Jones or the TSX of the day, we were so involved in the economy that we were actually part of the trade units. And up came this new, it was called capital M, capital B, Made Beaver, and it stood for so many guns and flour and all these things. So it shows you how engaged we were. And we went from that to this. I think everybody on the call today, and as you listen to Tabitha and Carol Ann, is all of us are about changing this picture. That community could be Attawapiskat or La Loche, Saskatchewan. How are we growing healthy economies, healthy communities, and a healthy workforce? We did some work on some research back in 2017, looking at corporate Indigenous engagements and partnerships. And there was a survey of 513 companies, and the average engagement score was 13. That's pretty dismal, 13% out of 100. 85% of corporations are disengaged. They do not have the motivation, the readiness, the competencies, and the readiness to engage. And most shockingly, only 1 in 4, 28%, recognize the Truth and Reconciliation corporate calls to action. Most of the engagement has been in the resource sector. But as Tabitha and I have discussed, we've seen other sectors like IT and others start to make some progress in the last 3 years. And I think we are starting to see, again, just more and more traction happening in other sectors of the economy. But you can really see a difference between areas of the resource sector when you compare it to things like advanced manufacturing, IT, hospitality, retail, and so on. If you want a copy of that report, you can get it on our website. We also developed a partnership competency guide to help people build partnerships models there as well. So what I find as we try to build the partnerships is on the employment side, how do you actually build the employment strategies and what are the practices and strategies? This is called the Inclusion Continuum. It's a 7-stage roadmap. And I find that these systems are helpful for managers and for companies to articulate their strategies, to start to decide where and how they build the competencies of their people, how they put together the operational and practice and invest in the right practices and strategies, and of course, implement and execute, and then measure the effectiveness. So this model has been well received. We actually score people on this continuum. And again, it's a very sort of pragmatic way to move forward with partnership commitments to actually mobilizing systems and investments by companies so that they can work effectively with communities. Some other things is as you look at navigating Indigenous employment programs, how do you go about designing in your partnership strategies the specific employment programs that you need? And again, this is more of a 5-staged approach. And before you even think about employment, I'll give you one example. You need to think about what is your brand and positioning in the Indigenous marketplace. Brand is everything. Companies spend lots of money on brand. And if you ask most companies, they'll say, you know, Kelly, I don't think we actually have much of a brand. I don't think we even have brand awareness. And so brand, attraction, and positioning are elements of your program design before you even get to things like the recruitment strategies. We're introducing an employer of choice certification program, and there's 2 on the market that you, the listeners, should know about. Tabitha's here from CCAB. They have the Progressive Aboriginal Relations Program from Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and we're introducing an employer-focused certification, the IW Employer of Choice. What's helpful about these certifications is if you look at the area of corporate social responsibility, the environment, waste management, these lean programs, there's certifications in many other fields. We think this area of certification, programs like our Employer of Choice and PAR, can actually help companies benchmark their efforts and mobilize and move their strategies forward. I want to finish off by talking about Luminary. And Luminary is a new initiative which is about advancing Indigenous innovation, economic transformation, employment, and well-being. And the real question is, how can we actually increase the collaborations amongst Indigenous business in the communities, university and college researchers, and research agencies? Today, we have 122 partners. We have 58 universities and colleges. These are vice presidents of research, deans of business schools. Some of them are the presidents. We have about 28 universities, or no, sort of 35 universities and about 24 colleges. We have about 40 Indigenous ECDEV corporations and companies. And then we have a host of NGOs and institutes and champions and foundations. Ryerson, who's hosting this webinar today, is one of our Luminary partners. And so really what we're doing now is we're going into a planning stage, and we'll be engaging with other Indigenous organizations like the two ladies here, CCAB and Indigenomics. And we're going to really look at how do we build these collaborations and the systems and models needed to accelerate Indigenous innovation. One of the things that we started and what Ryerson brought forward is how do we focus on students? And if you look at these students at the MBA and the PhD level, no one has looked at the career trajectories or the career motivations of this cohort. And so we're pleased to, Michael Mahalowitz, who's on the call today, and Professor Andrew LePlume, we're working with them on this, an engagement survey, a motivation survey. We received some funds from SHRC and from a foundation. And so this little project around Indigenous student research is moving ahead as we move Luminary forward. I thought this might be of interest to the viewers, is that there's this thing called the Global Innovation Index, and it really looks at the innovation index of countries around the world. Switzerland's #1, Canada's #17, and the Republic of Malawi in Africa is 117. And you might be saying, what the heck is this about? Well, if you look at the characteristics that describe the state of innovation of Malawi, those characteristics could describe the state of innovation with Indigenous Canada. So there's lots of room and opportunity to grow. There's a real desire and a willingness. As Carol Ann said, we're looking forward. How do we actually move forward into the 21st and 22nd century? We have enough reports on the problem and the issues. How are we moving forward with innovation, solutions, and growing opportunities that are good, not just for Indigenous people, but I find many of the efforts that we are advancing are good for mainstream Canadians. Finally, we have to bring in Indigenous thought and thinking. The first one is an Inuktitut term. There are 7 societal principles in the IQ principles within the Inuit. Quanartinik is about being innovative and resourceful. So innovation has been a part of Inuit thinking for thousands of years. The medicine wheel is about balance in 4 directions, and our elder spoke to that as she prayed for, and opened up the session today. And Albert Marshall has this concept of two-eyed seeing. How do you respect and value traditional and Western ways of knowing? And this has really captured people's imaginations as we look to building an Indigenous-led innovation ecosystem that truly will allow us to look at innovation and advancing Indigenous economic priorities. So Luminary, Michael, you asked me to speak to this. We're entering into this 1-year planning. We want to have a 5-year strategy and plan with real programs, tools and services that are built, co-created, co-developed, and then validated by all the players. And then we'll be able to provide some real value and benefit to our people and to our communities and achieve that green picture we were talking about. I will close there and turn to you for Q&A.
This has been just amazing. If we can If you can unshare your screen there, Kelly, that'd be great. Thank you. And so I am going to pose 4 questions, and these 4 questions are for our 3 speakers. And so each of you can respond if you like. Question 1, how the sorry, I need some water. How do your teachings affect you when you're doing your work? And how do you think culture and values have helped shape your own business practices through the Indigenous communities? Because some, you know, even though I'm thinking, this is me ad-libbing here, even though you are from one community, doesn't mean that you have an understanding of what is required for other communities. So when we go nationwide, I think that there's a sensitivity that's important that people who want to partner with us understand. No such thing as that pan-Indian. It would make it a lot easier for everybody, but we're just not out there. So whoever wants to start with a response to that, please.
I think from my own personal point of view and my personal experience, I follow the 7 grandfather teachings in everything that I do. And I completely agree that, I mean, from a humble perspective, first, I have much to learn about my own Anishinaabe culture and my own Anishinaabe history as just to start with. So of course, in meeting with any other community, even within my treaty of Robinson Huron, we all have a different history and a different way of being and living. And we're all, you know, communities are also on a different path of where they are in their capacity within the business world and economic development. And that's really, you know, based on the resources that maybe they've been able to take advantage of, or maybe it's been on the leaders that they've had in the past. But really, from going to one community to a community right next door, the capacity within that community and where that community is on their path of a healing journey, or where they are on their path of a transformation into more of a revenue generating area, is so different. So I think really my first key thing is to be humble in understanding that you really know a very small amount from every community that you're working with. And then I think the other, personally for me, in business, but also as a leader within my organization and how I want CCAB to be, our reputation and our mandate and the way we work is to be completely transparent and collaborative. So the one key thing is that I am keenly transparent with my team, and that enables my team to be very transparent as well with me and with everyone that we work with and our partners. And then also for collaboration. So you know, we are all, those of us on this panel, our friends at Ryerson, the many other national Indigenous economic development organizations, we are all working towards a similar goal, and we're only going to be able to achieve that if we work together. So that part of collaboration has been very important in my time here at CCAB.
Thank you, Tabitha. Anybody else want to comment on that one?
Sure, I will. Caroline here. My work within Indigenomics has been focused on contrasting the concepts of growth within a mainstream economy and the worldview behind that, and contrasting that with Indigenous worldview and concepts of connection and a structure of relational economics. In my own New Channel tradition, we have core values that are essentially built around the strength of our relationships and connections, which is entirely cosmological in its depth and scope. When we look at the concept of economy, it looks entirely different from an Indigenous worldview. And it's this worldview that needs to be brought into modern economic and business relationships, because even managing risk or managing growth establishes entirely different decision sets. So risk from a mainstream perspective versus risk from an Indigenous perspective, it's when Indigenous worldview is included that allows Indigenous participation within resource or major projects. And it's the ability to manage risk is really our participation within projects and regional and national economies. So from my perspective, really my worldview as a New Channel person is based on teachings around caring for one another, helping one another, respect, and the concept of connection, which has essentially led me down that pathway of Indigenomics being an expression of relational economics, which is again a response to the crisis of economy, of how we're experiencing it, and the foundational elements that are missing within that. So what's important in that is to be able to demonstrate how decisions are made within an Indigenous worldview in economy today. Thank you.
And Joanne, I would say, in terms of sort of the values and the teachings, I'd go to, in your opening prayer, and you said, all my relations. And I think that as we sort of look at what COVID's done and the crisis it's created, is that I think the more that we live by that teaching and we do see everyone as my relations, it really does speak to the meaning of inclusion in its truest sense. It's about our common humanity. And I would also reiterate from the 7 grandfather teachings that Tabitha referred to as humility. I mean, I think I'm a better leader today than I was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. So I think humility about constantly trying to improve, be a better leader, and really respect the Indigenous diversity that does exist. But there's another teaching in the 7 teachings that I think we need, and it's bravery. I think we need to be brave and bold, and I think there is, it started with groups like I Don't Know More and others, is that we need a bravery. You see what's happening with George Floyd and the killing of George Floyd and Chantel Moore, that I think society is looking for change, and it's not just by being bold. I think we have to be brave to really, I think, change the rhetoric and the systems and to really disrupt, I think, many of the things that have existed for far too long. Case in point, Tabitha and I are on a group with 8 other leaders designing a national Indigenous economic development strategy. In 2020, here we are with Indigenous people designing Indigenous economic strategies. Here's Carol Ann Hilton writing about it in her book and advancing the idea of a $100 billion economy. So I think Indigenous people, we're being brave and we're stepping forward and advancing solutions that are going to be good, not just for Indigenous people, but for Canada.
Thank you all for that. I just have to throw in my 2 cents while I'm here because I can't help myself. I really am so tired of us being recognized from a deficit lens. And I think it has been so long that we have been told we can't, we're not good enough. And, because of all of our, and people have alluded to it here, kind of, most of us didn't grow up in a traditional fashion on our reserve, but we grew up in other locales or maybe separated from family. So this whole self-identity thing has left us kind of believing that who we are is not good enough, and maybe we don't know enough about being Indigenous. And so we have to get right with that. I had somebody who I really respected in the community came up to me one time and said, "You shouldn't be doing teachings." And I said, "Oh yeah, why is that?" "Well, you don't know your language." well, you know, my instant 15-year-old wanted to just throat punch and it's all over. But I just looked and said, if you have a problem with the language that I'm speaking, take it up with the creator, because this is the one he gave me. And I think when we can stand solid as an individual that spreads to families and it spreads to communities, that we no longer have to justify who we are or say, come do business with us, but hey, you should get over here and see what we're capable of, because we've been innovative since we drew our first breath. So I'm just so excited about this. And, you know, anyways, I'm going to go on and I'm going to go to the next question, because like I said, I could go on and on here. So question 2 is that, you know, and it's been talked to here, but the importance of us coming into community and building community. I think not only do we, you know, and it's been talked to here, we build communities of people that we work with, like-minded people on projects. And it goes one step beyond that, is where we're building kind of additional families. We get so into the relationship, we need to know that person to build trust. And I think for some people outside of that, that's scary, because they're not used to talking and sharing their feelings. So I just would really like to hear what you guys think about the importance of community work in the work that you're doing.
I'll start. Because I do a lot of public speaking around the country, I always end my talks with who wants to play Indigenomics, and it's an invitation. And what is important in that is that there's also a response to that question. So my email is constantly full of people saying, how do I play Indigenomics? What does that mean? What does that look like? And how can I help? So the engagement construct of Indigenomics is meant to be neutral. It's meant to be non-threatening, and it's not weighted within the legal structures or relationships and the tensions and challenges that exist within that. I think it also speaks to a readiness to engage, and that's also, I see as essential in building community of leadership, of a belief in that personal leadership of where are you located within this conversation of economic reconciliation. So within that spectrum of, there's this kind of far side of really don't care, unengaged, uneducated, to the middle who are asking the questions of, well, what is important in this? Where do I begin to look? I feel uncomfortable in asking these questions and feeling the sense of shoulds that I should know this, or not knowing who to go to ask these questions or to find the resources. And then there's others that may also not understand the kind of the complete historical context, but are saying, I'm here and willing to engage, be uncomfortable, and let's see what we can build together. And it's in those places that I think this leadership in this conversation is really also driving community towards the conversations that matter, and driving conversations that lead by example, saying we can do things differently, either here within the business school or within the university, and that bringing our attention to increasing understanding and increasing opportunities for relationship is really what this time is about, and what the intention and purpose of economic reconciliation is. Thank you.
Whoops, does anyone else want to add to that?
I'll say this quickly about community is you know, there is this issue of social capital, and social capital is the bonds and linkages between and among groups of people. And again, Joanne, if we said, like you said, let's not always take a deficit approach. What is the level of social capital inside cities, towns, villages, reserves, Métis and Inuit communities and settlements? And I think there is high social capital. There is, and I think there are some real assets here. If you look at how some of the communities have been able to respond to COVID, I'd argue that there's something that Canadians could learn from some of the Indigenous communities and how they weathered and how there's more resilience and there's community supports. So I think this area of social capital is integral to looking at the area of community development. I think the second thing is that many of these communities are nation building. They are rebuilding communities. They're reclaiming communities. They're building the institutions. They're learning how to run a school board. They're building a school. They're taking over economic development, child welfare, these types of things. So the whole issue of community and community development, very mature for some, but new for others. And they're learning how to actually run community and the institutions that are within those communities. And I think the third and final thing is that unlike other communities, some of these communities go back thousands of years with their traditions, their burial grounds, their ceremonies. So their connection to that community is deeper and different than
Absolutely.
other towns and villages.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Tabitha, did you have anything you'd like to say?
I might just add that the work that we do at CCB, the work that I do when I think about community, is when we look at Indigenous businesses, and the purpose for a number of those businesses is often not about profit. It's often initially those businesses are created because there's a need within their community or a need that they've seen within their people, being able to help and to give back to community. So the more work that we do to help promote and make sure those businesses are successful, the more impact we're going to have on helping to grow and help those communities. I think also we know from our research that Indigenous businesses employ more Indigenous people than non-Indigenous businesses. So the more we can do to support Indigenous businesses and help them grow, the more connections we're going to have to those communities as well. So, you know, while we're called Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, the work that we're doing is really to support community and Indigenous people.
Good. Thanks very much, everyone. Great comments. Okay, so question number 3. Other than economic growth, what are some of the benefits of partnering with education and research institutions for communities? So how is Ryerson, for example, beneficial for you guys to be connected to? Whoever wants to answer that first. If nobody wants to answer it, we'll just...
I'll start. A number of ways. Ryerson is the largest business school in Canada. You have the Diversity and the Diversity Institute, run by Wendy Coutier and her team. You've got, you have the Future Skills Center that you're advancing. I think about the sort of the reach and the desire and the vision of Ryerson to connect and help Indigenous companies, communities, and people, you know, achieve their potential. So I think you've adopted the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation. You are looking for ways to bridge research, to advance new innovations, and for example, with the Skills Center, with work integrated learning and other such things. You've not contained it to one area. You've actually got this working across the university, across different parts of the academic community. So I would say that multidisciplinary approach and thinking is important at Ryerson. And so, like I said, I think, and you're in it for the long haul. I mean, you're not doing this as a project. You're into this. You're deeply engaged. You're hiring academia. You're leveraging dollars with federal governments. You're working with groups like CCAB, us, perhaps with Carol Ann will in the future. And I think this idea of the co-creation is sort of integral to Ryerson's thinking. So that's some of the things I've seen, Joanne, in terms of Ryerson's efforts and goals in that area.
And I think that, you know, that when I hear that, what a wonderful new legacy, given that the name of the university is Egerton Ryerson, and we know his involvement with the residential school system and the controversy that the name can bring up. So it's nice that we kind of have the proof in the pudding that if we just keep going one foot in front of the other, that things do change. Tabitha or Carol Ann, anything you'd like to add to working with institutional partners?
For sure. So I think that in establishing a 100-year vision of the Indigenous economy, what becomes important in that is facilitating that economic space for leadership. So having Indigenous scholars and the increasing number of Indigenous students in finance, commerce, business, what becomes important in that is being able to engage in that's relevant to Indigenous economic design. So not necessarily just economic growth, but designing and establishing research agendas that not just meet an institution's needs, but is also supporting actualization of the Indigenous economy. What I always say and want to highlight is that even the space for education and placing oneself as a student, what is important, even looking at something such as the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the simplest construct of self-determination, that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination, and within that, the right to an economy. We are the only people in Canada, in this entire country, that have had to fight even for the right to have an economy. There's no other people that have had to fight that same level to the validity of our modern existence based on our historical place within our territories and within our community. So even starting with that alone is the starting point of Indigenous business and the place of Indigenous business, understanding the challenges, but also understanding the places where Indigenous business success has been able to have been achieved. So that balance within the institution to, again, move beyond seeing Indigenous peoples as a burden on the fiscal system to seeing Indigenous peoples as economic powerhouses. Those are two different narratives. And I think even having examples like the speaker series where you're bringing our attention and facilitating the space to build understanding, establish education, and have the conversations which support the significance of the Indigenous economy within the larger context of the school itself, as well as the business content, is one of the fundamental questions of education within the business environment, of actually understanding the context of the Indigenous economy and Indigenous businesses. Thank you.
Thanks. Tabitha, did you want to add anything?
No, just really to echo that Ryerson has been a great partner with us as well through the Diversity Institute and Future Skills, and that additional research into looking at youth and looking at where the gaps are in education and in where our youth are going to school and how they're doing and ensuring that they complete their education, but then how is that working with Indigenous workers? That research has been so important and has been of a keen interest to all of those that we've discussed with it. I think also, from a gender lens as well, that work as well has been really important, and we're moving forward on future research as well with the Diversity Institute on Indigenous women entrepreneurs, looking specifically at what those barriers are. So it's been such a key help for us to be able to partner with institutions like Ryerson who are interested in leading that research.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I took that senior position, because the leadership is such that we are getting some really, really good work done. And there's a long commitment to that. So Okay, so final question, and then we're going to open it up for some Q&A. What are the ways we can support Indigenous students specifically through mental health or social capital? I know those are pretty specific, but I think sometimes we make those questions seem too hard, and I think it just boils down to relationship with self and relationship with each other. So whoever wants to comment first, take it away.
I think panel touches this, and you know, for students who are at Ryerson who are just learning about their indigeneity or are there away from their home, knowing that the school that you're going to finds us of interest is such a key point of view. And also to helping build that community within the school, and an opportunity to build that community within the school for sure for mental health is so important. And having you and elders in residence at the university is so key for youth, especially so many Indigenous youth who are away from home and from their community and their culture to have that support. So, and
Yeah.
just having that, you know, feeling like it's a safe space that appreciates and honors where you come from.
I would add to that, having Indigenous mentors as well as Indigenous scholarships becomes important in supporting Indigenous students. Quite often the pathway to getting into school, a community may be underfunded from its federal relationships. So accessing student supports to ensure their success and active participation within the schools becomes really important. Thank you.
Yeah, well, Ryerson's Aboriginal Student Services, run by Monica McKay, she's the director. They do tremendous work with supporting the students emotionally through ceremony and counseling, and also, you know, academically, as well as in just the day-to-day living and supporting them in any way that they can. And also the Aboriginal Education Council. So the students can come and look and see that there are things very active at Ryerson. And, you know, just to toot Muhammad's horn, you know, to get me to sit on the Board of Governors was something he had to go out and go after. And I really, really appreciated that, because I might not have a vote, but boy, I got a mouth. And, you know, my point of view can be heard. And I think, you know, that's one of the things that I think is vital, whether it's business or whether it's working with people who are working in business, is that you be a person of your word, that your actions follow your what you said you're going to do. And the less you say about it and the more you do, the higher up you rank in my books, you know, like that's really important. So I really am proud of Ryerson for that. Kelly, did you want to say something around this question?
I think if you look at the indigenization of programs and program supports for students across Canada, the universities and colleges are ahead of industry.
Yeah.
So they generally have put in place, like you said, an Aboriginal Student Support Center, a council, reference groups, and so on. But look, the issue of mental health is not just exclusive to Indigenous people. Mental health issues facing workers, facing students, it's a major, major issue. That's why Bell Canada and others are investing and looking at the area of mental health. I think for Indigenous students, it's really some of the basic things. It's preparation and anticipation. What increases your anxiety is the unknown. And so all this preparation, you know, in the workplace, you would call it onboarding, and getting people prepared for the unknown and to get comfortable with that, and constant feedback, and having the support systems. I mean, look, school is work. You have to develop study skills. If you do not know how to study, you will not succeed. Or you'll succeed, you won't be as good as you could have been. So I think on a very, very pragmatic level, some of these systems and supports need to be there. Early interventions need to be there before people drop out. They have to keep dropping in. So like I said, I think that everyone's learning from each other. And your point about social capital, I mean, building networks. And so I'm a big believer in inclusion, is that don't just create networks with Indigenous to Indigenous people. Get Indigenous people connected to the minority groups, the other groups within Ryerson or within universities and education groups, get them involved in international groups. That's the world that they're living in. The world is a global place. And we're actually not doing a service to Indigenous people if we just isolate them. That's not the way forward. So I think universities have a role to play in really building that inclusion and that reach to other groups that perhaps, you know, Indigenous people have not been exposed to Muslims or persons of color because they've grown up in their community in
Yes, absolutely.
the Yukon. And so they just have not had that exposure. And I think university and colleges are that place, that incubation for inclusion, so they get to learn and start to understand there are, you know, other cultures from around the world. And what better place than a place like Toronto, Ryerson, be one of the richest, diverse places, that Vancouver and others, right?
Right. Then one thing too I will say about Ryerson is that Mohammedan senior management is very, very much into mental health. That's a priority for the students, for the staff, for the faculty. And it's something that we talk about more and more, you know, like the council, I'm on the mental health committee, and there was talk about how can they make it more holistic in their approach to counseling Indigenous people, because sometimes you don't want to talk to another Indigenous person because they may know your family, and what you want to talk about, you don't want to talk about with them because you don't want to get it back. So for so many reasons, we have to think outside that box ourselves, as well as, you know, Sugar Bear was one of my teachers, and one of the things he said to me, you know, like, he said, if it wasn't for Western medicine, I wouldn't walk because I wouldn't have a hip. And he said, we are here, and the Creator brought all these people from all over the world to us with all their teachings, all their ways, and all their medicine. So there's no mistake in that. So let's take advantage, and it makes us richer and more. And surprisingly, there's so much connection between those medicines and ways of knowing and being. So the more that people get educated or have experiences on the real world, the better they are. I want to open this up now to, and I don't know who the moderating is doing on the Q&A. If it's me, I don't know. You're already mechanism. Okay, so Michael, can you come on board here for a second, please? Talk to me, Michael.
Hi, Joanne.
Hi.
You're welcome to do it. If you're not comfortable, I'm more than happy to moderate the Q&A.
My mouth is going to fall off here.
No worries.
Okay. You do the Q&A and I'll stay here and just watch.
Okay, so we had a great question from Joanne. Is there already a mechanism for Indigenous communities that are having success with economic development initiatives and entrepreneurial ventures are able to share these stories, learnings with other Indigenous communities that are not as far ahead on this economic continuum?
I could start on there. So through the economic development corporations, if we look specifically at them, I can think of two areas. I do think we all need to do more to share what economic development corporations are doing, and even what they are and how many people they employ. So there are a significant number of economic development corporations across Canada. Some of them employ up to 800 people. Just as one point of reference, when the wage subsidy came out for COVID-19, Aboriginal economic development corporations were not eligible to apply. And that was a gap in the government's programming. And we had to do significant education at the government and Ministry of Finance to demonstrate how many people were employed by these corporations and the significant amount of revenue that they do bring into the economy. But there is CANDO, which is an association of economic development officers who do share stories, and that is a network of an association that they can get together and have shared learnings. And then not to give a plug, but I guess it's a plug. CCAB also has an award for excellence for Aboriginal Economic Development Corporations that we hand out once a year to really celebrate an economic development corporation who is doing great work and showing incredible growth within their business. So just in trying to ensure that we continue to celebrate.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. A lot of work. Sorry, go ahead.
I would add, Michael, that, you know, building on what Tabitha said, I mean, Tabitha, you guys have published, like with the excellence in Aboriginal relations, you know, to the question, you could look at examples like that, read about the person, sometimes as an entrepreneur or the community. Those types of reference points, those are some of the leading edge best practices or promising practices. Candu has the Economic Developer of the Year award, so you could go back and look at those examples. NAC is the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations. I think they also provide awards. So I think the Inspire also has their awards program, and they've honored people in the area of economic development and business. So I think those, you know, to the question posed by this person, those are good reference points in terms of some of the leading edge practices. If they're looking to sort of get a collection and a cross section of examples across First Nations, Métis, Inuit communities and people.
Thank you, Kelly.
I'll just add to that. Here in BC, we have the newly established Association of Indigenous Economic Development Corporations that are learning how to collaborate and build stories of success and challenges as a group of corporations. And I think what we're going to be seeing from that is a strengthened network and a strengthened story around economic design. And just, we had been referring to examples that highlight Indigenous success. I also wanted to add, this will be the second year of the Indigenomics 10 to Watch list. So we'll be unleashing that list in October. So it'll be the second year, but it's demonstrating not just Indigenous businesses, but partnerships, initiatives, and Indigenous businesses that are demonstrating leadership in the emerging $100 billion Indigenous economy. So I think there's numerous examples that support the answer to this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I also had a question. So I've been wondering about this for some time. So Indigenous businesses, and not to talk about Indigenous people as a homogenous group, but are often known for management structures and leadership styles. And we talked briefly about community-centered approach. These businesses are increasingly being recognized as being more conducive to generating resources that are highly valued by entrepreneurs and key attributes to long-term business success. So I'm wondering, what do you feel Western businesses can learn from Indigenous ways of being and approaches to businesses?
I'll take a start at that. I think that Western business is so driven towards profit, and the concept of corporation as an individual human is polarizing concepts of community, whereas we see Indigenous business much more focused that an indication of success is how business can support cultural identity or cultural practices. We look at examples of strengthened or empowered Indigenous communities where business is a tool for community well-being. And I think that's where you begin to see the distinction in understanding what is the cause of success, the indicators of success, and that the inclusion of elders within business success, the way to use business specifically for a community to understand a pathway for youth to see themselves in their own future is something that's instrumental and distinct with Indigenous business, is that both elder inclusion, language, culture, and youth is a very clear distinction of what the intention of what defining what success looks like is so much different than what you would see in a mainstream concepts of success. Thank you.
How about you go? Then I will.
That's a great question, and don't know that I want to follow Carol Ann's answer because I don't know how much more I can add. But I do think, you know, to follow up on Carol Ann, I think we have seen so many studies about the importance of diversity in any business and any boardroom table, and the advantage of a business success by bringing other voices to the table and other perspectives to the table. And I think in an Indigenous business that looks at the whole of community and how that impacts the whole of community, it does that in the same way from a diversity perspective. And, you know, I think also Indigenous people have been innovators for such a long time and have been in business since the fur trade. So it's not, you know, while we have been removed from the Canadian economy and are making our way back, it's not that it's new to us as a people. So we definitely have that strength to continue and to adapt to new ways of living and to new economies. And I think that strength is being shown, particularly, you know, now through COVID, as we see so many businesses continue to succeed, although they have more distinct barriers than others.
I would say there's three things, Michael, just to add on to what the ladies offered up. There is a greater form of collective leadership, generally, inside Indigenous companies and corporations. Secondly, where if you follow the profits, so the term that everyone's using is own source revenue. We want to create our own source revenue. First of all, that money, those revenues, those profits do not go offshore. Every dime is spent in Canada. And if you follow the money, where is it spent? They take all that money, they throw it back into a dividend that goes back to the community if they're an economic development corporation, and it goes into education, housing, health, social services, children. I mean, so it's a total replenishment of those funds back to community development. I think the third thing is I've seen economic plans that are 25 to 50 years forecasts. So the long-term planning, looking at resources, their people, that's some of the planning that's happened inside Indigenous corporations, is that real long-term planning vision. And I don't think there's many Canadian companies that have a 25 or 50-year plan. Very similar to Koreans and Asians, right? They generally have very long-term planning as well. So some similarities between Asian culture and Indigenous thinking and culture and planning.
Thank you. I love how you touched on difference in leadership styles and in fostering a more inclusive workspace and almost collectivist mindset. We had another question from Sana, actually. She was wondering, in your recent studies, where do you see the biggest gap in skills training, either specific skills or in specific sectors?
Well, you know, what's interesting about skills is, I mean, you can look at hard skills, so connectivity skills, IT skills, and so on, but I don't have it at my fingertips, but, you know, some good work coming out from RBC looking at the long-term forecast. 50% of the jobs that are going to be, you know, even 15 years from now, we don't have the skill sets for. So I think creativity, for example, is one of the skills and that they're talking about, and that you're going to need in order to be able to adapt very fast and very easily to the changing skill demands. So I think even how we talk about skills and soft skills, the ability of creativity, the teamwork, the ability to work with others, those are going to be some of the requirements to be able to adopt and adapt to, again, this area of disruption and to the changing economic skill sets that are going to be needed.
I think I would take the question a little bit of a different direction. And I would take the question, where are we currently seeing skills demand? What is important in that shift is the skill requirement within nation building and within a business environment. For what I've seen currently, over kind of this longer term flow of education, we saw this early, let's say a 20-year span, where we saw really early high demand within education, say law, and that shift that has occurred now of where we're seeing high demand is within engineering. An Indigenous engineering student cannot finish school without being headhunted. Business students, finance, accounting, technology, it's this type of demand, I think, that's the next level senior management within this structure of nation building, that when we look at areas of high demand for Indigenous capacity, that shift becomes important, of not looking at where our people are not filling the space of skills, but also what is the demand of nation building that the skills are needed to support the evolution of our nations and our economies. Thank you.
Okay.
Tabitha, did you have anything to add, or?
No, I think I agree on STEM. So we did just launch a report with Diversity Institute called Mapping Skills about youth, and it does speak a lot more on graduation and post-secondary and moving on to business schools, but it does have some stats, and I think I just keyed on this as an engineering grad myself, that I think in 2016, the number of Indigenous youth that had a STEM background was 4.16%, and non-Indigenous was greater than 11. So significant gap there. And as Carol Ann said, that's really where the needs are going to be. And similar to what Kelly has said, if we look towards automation and how we may see changes in the workforce sector, we need to ensure that we're encouraging Indigenous youth to go into those sectors that are going to be able to respond more to that type of change and automation in our workforce. So how do we, I think the other piece is there's a real gap in that type of research on Indigenous youth and Indigenous lens on any research. I think, you know, from what Kelly has said about the projects that they're working on as well, and these collaborations are so important, that we need to do more research to understand why those barriers still exist and how can we improve or attract Indigenous youth into STEM projects. And we're seeing some great work and innovative work on how do we do engineering that's more culturally appropriate or more tied to your community, and how do we increase that interest of Indigenous youth. But in order to understand those sectors, we need more research, and then in order to ensure that we're closing those gaps, we need to do more research to understand the barriers as well.
I'm just going to jump in and add my 2 cents on that one, because I do a lot of work with the Toronto District School Board as well. And I think we need to get at our youth in high school and start getting them interested in STEM. You know, lots of times students come to university, and after their first year, they may shift their majors. But I think if we can have more positive role models coming to schools and talking to students about working in STEM and getting out there and getting those, and just what that would do to help them and their communities. I think that's something I'd like to see some focus on somehow, some way. Okay, so any final comments? Kelly, did you want to say something?
I just pulled this up while Tabitha was talking. Is that here's 4 quick facts. More than 25% of Canadian jobs will be heavily disrupted by technology in the coming decade. That's 1 in 4 jobs. Fully half will go through a significant overhaul of the skills required. So you talk about the speed that we're going to need for universities and colleges to be able to adapt. An assessment of 20,000 skills across 300 occupations showed that there will be increasing demand for skills such as critical thinking, coordination, social perceptiveness, active listening, and complex problem solving. And thirdly, Canadian employers are generally not prepared. They're not prepared through hiring, training, or retraining to recruit and develop the skills needed to make their organizations more competitive in a digital economy. So that's the future, and that's where we have to keep our eye on, is that's what's coming, and how do we prepare today for that future that's going to be here tomorrow?
I think students on all levels are going to be asking for very different things than they've ever asked for before. You know, my grandson can't read cursive writing. They don't need it. You know, they don't need to know everyday math. They have apps where you can click on the question and it gives you the answer. I mean, it's so digital, they're learning, that they're looking to learn different things. And I think the youth that are coming up are going to be asking so much more from us as a society on how to solve these problems, because we have the most awareness, I think, because of social media and because of things that are out there, of where the youth are asking questions that they didn't ask before. And I think we have to play catch up. Well, I just am so stoked. This was just an amazing. I learned so much. I'm so excited about all the work that you're doing. I know this isn't easy work, but I also know it's incredibly rewarding. And in our traditional teachings, we do all those things for the next 7 generations. And I certainly know that the ancestors are shining down and looking at us going, yeah, you know, there's that entrepreneurial. You know, one of the things that I learned about one of our Cree teachings are the active non-interference, which means we accept people from where they're at and work with them there. And I think that's a really, that's what I'm hearing today on both sides, trying to teach that and encourage that in the corporate world and get them comfortable with that. So I really want to thank you all for taking the time out to come and do this, to share with your expertise. Thanks to all of you for being here and sharing and being warm and honest and just being, you know, what we are about relationship. And I'm sure everybody has learned a lot of stuff. So thank you all, and take good care, and we'll talk soon. Michael, do you want to stay online? I want to talk to you for a second.
Thank you.